Welcome to the Writing Westward podcast. I'm your host, Brenden Rensink. Today we speak with journalist Rebecca Robinson and photographer Strom about their books, Voices from Bears Ears, Seeking Common Ground on Sacred Land, and Bears Ears, Views from a Sacred Land. Thanks for listening. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Each episode features a conversation with an author or scholar of new works that explore the North American West. We hope that our discussions will spark your curiosity to learn more and think differently about the North American West as a region and its peoples, environments, histories, literature, and so forth. You can follow Writing Westward on Facebook at Writing Westward Podcast or on Twitter at Writing West. You can listen on our website, writingwestward.org, or subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. We're listed on most major distributors. To learn more about the Redd Center, our programming, live-streamed lectures, funding opportunities for research and events, or anything else, find us at reddcenter.byu.edu. That's reddcenter.byu.edu. You can get more regular updates about the Redd Center on Facebook and Twitter as well. Anyone living in the American West over the past few years will no doubt have at least heard of Bears Ears. This is an area in southeastern Utah that has stirred considerable controversy recently, as various parties have fought and debated over how its public lands should be regulated and managed. The region is densely packed with indigenous ruins, rock art, and burials, as well as sites of current sacred significance for various tribal communities, and many have fought for it to be protected as a national monument. Others in the region opposed that designation for various reasons. Others yet were split, seeing both pros and cons to the various viewpoints. In December of 2016, then President Barack Obama declared the Bears Ears National Monument. But a year later, President Donald Trump reduced its size by approximately 85%. Many cried foul, noting the influence of mining industry lobbyists on the administration's decision, while others praised it. Throughout all the public and private debates before and after these 2016 and 2017 events, the media failed to capture the diversity of local opinion and the complexity of the various parties' views. Very few took the time to listen, and instead drove dialogue where opposing sides largely talked past one another. In this, Rebecca Robinson and Strom have done us a great service by publishing their 2 volumes. For the project, Robinson and Strom became acquainted with and interviewed nearly all of the major public figures in the Bears Ears debates, as well as many largely unknown to the general public. They listened with empathy and allowed their subjects to express their views. For Voices from Bears Ears, Seeking Common Ground on Sacred Land, published by the University of Arizona Press in 2018, Robinson weaves the interviews together with insightful commentary, background information, context, and challenging questions. The text is complemented by Strom's photography throughout of the interviewed subjects and, importantly, the land. George F. Tompkins Publishing, in collaboration with the University of Arizona Press, also published a large-format companion volume of Strom's photography entitled Bears Ears, Views from a Sacred Land. Both are supported by an active website and blog, bearsearscountry.com. Anyone wanting to cut through the oft polemical and unbalanced rhetoric of opposing sides on the Bears Ears issues should read this book. Anyone embroiled in the issue themselves should read it as well, if for no other reason than to pause and take a moment to try to understand why opposing sides believe what they do, regardless of whether we change our own views in the end. There is value in understanding people on their own terms. There is value in listening. The prospect of meaningful progress, collaboration, or resolution on Bears Ears or any of the other many contentious issues in the American West are slim if we don't learn how to pause, listen, and practice empathy. Rebecca Robinson and Strom, thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
Thanks for having us, Brenden.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I look forward to the conversation.
So this is a little bit of a new experiment for the podcast, having 3 of us, and hopefully we'll be able to make it work. The 2 books we're going to be talking about today that you guys did together, Voices from Bears Ears, Seeking Common Ground on Sacred Land, and then the companion photography volume, Bears Ears, Views from a Sacred Land. And we'll probably spend most of our time with the Voices one specifically, but it also includes a lot of the photographs that are featured in that second volume as well. I spent quite a bit of time with this book, and I wasn't sure what to expect. And I was so pleased and so excited with the work that you guys did here. And I'm really excited to feature it on the podcast because I think it is a volume that a lot of people need to pick up and spend some time with. So it gets my ringing endorsement. At least if you haven't received positive praise from anyone else, you at least have it from me.
It's much appreciated.
Part of the reason I recommend it to people so highly is that we have this very contentious issue that's been contentious for a number of years. It boiled over in, I think, some unexpected ways that we'll get to in the middle of your guys' project. And there's so many different voices and perspectives on it, and you guys capture so many of them in a very empathetic way where you let people speak their minds. And I think you did a really fair job of that. So can you tell us what brought you to this project, how this started?
Sure, I'll start, and then Steve, you can chime in because this is inherently a collaborative endeavor. So Steve and I long wanted to work together. I've been a journalist for over a decade now, and Steve obviously has been photographing landscapes in the Southwest for many years. And so we'd always wanted to find the right project on which to work together. And this project was born out of a desire to honor Steve's late wife and my grandmother, Karen Strom. She so loved these landscapes and was so deeply connected to them and to Native culture as well. And in the wake of her passing in spring of 2014, Steve and I found ourselves trying to think of a way to honor her memory. And initially, we were looking at efforts to preserve the Greater Canyonlands region as a national monument. It was a proposal put together by a coalition of environmental organizations. And the goal there was to expand the existing boundaries of Canyonlands National Park into a greater area that was proposed for protection way back in the early 60s when Canyonlands National Park was created. And so initially this was really supposed to be sort of a love letter to the landscape, maybe a more traditional coffee table book, extolling the beauty of this magical landscape. But in our first interviews with people from conservation organizations, they said, actually, there's a much more interesting story brewing further south of here, and we're really shifting our efforts toward this new initiative to protect area in southeastern Utah in what's known as the Bears Ears region, or what came to be known as the Bears Ears region as the debate over Bears Ears National Monument heated up. And so we said, well, wow, that sounds like something worth investigating.
Is this a type of topic you've done previously in your reporting?
No, interestingly enough, I've been sort of a generalist, and I've done reporting on everything from healthcare to the criminal justice system in California to arts and culture in Oregon. I worked as a radio producer at an NPR affiliate in Portland, Oregon, for a while back in the day. And so I've really covered a number of different topics, but environmental issues, environmental justice issues, was a topic completely new to me. I was very familiar with these landscapes, having traveled to and hiked in them with my grandparents and immediate family for over 20 years, but I'd never done any reporting that was environmentally focused, and nothing about the American Southwest.
And Stephen, you'd also hiked and photographed the region for a long time. Is that kind of your main connection there?
It is, and I'd like to add one thing, which is that although I've been photographing there since the late 1970s, the attachment to the land and some of the cultural issues that inform the Bears Ears debate started when my wife and I spent a couple of summers teaching on the Navajo reservation, we felt that photographing that landscape was, in some sense, taking something from the land without giving back, and we felt that it would be of significant interest to work with Native peoples, and so we spent a couple of summers teaching at what was then Navajo Community College, and now it's called Dinek College, and that led to not only deeper immersion in the landscape, but also a growing number of connections with folks in the Native community. One of the earlier consequences of that set of summers spent on the Navajo reservation was a connection through multiple links to the poet, essayist, and musician Joy Harjo. We collaborated on a book called Secrets from the Center of the World, which has some powerful poetry from Joy and some complementary images of the region that I put together. So,
well, that's wonderful. And she's now the poet laureate, right?
It's true.
Of the United States.
That's true. I like to say that I have superb choice in women, but that sounds not only condescending, but in any event, I've been blessed to have a strong wife who always extended the limits of my imagination, and collaborations with any number of women, both in my professional work as an astronomer and as a photographer who has focused on environmental issues.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate what you noted, that you felt photographing the region, you were taking something away. And I mean, as researchers with Native peoples, that there has been a long tradition and concerns about going into Native communities, conducting interviews, but almost as kind of an extractive industry where you're extracting information out of a community and not necessarily giving back or serving that community. I love that you have that sensitivity of wanting to serve and give back to, be it the communities or the landscape itself, which I think these two volumes both do in a variety of ways. Well, Rebecca, you kind of get to this a little bit in the introduction where you talk about conducting these interviews down in the Bears Ears area, and you talk about openness and you talk about listening, which suggests to me, again, a kind of a different approach, interviewing approach than just going and extracting information out to tell a story. How did you build this desire or sense of really wanting to listen and understand what people were trying to say?
Well, I think some of that just comes from my journalism background and the desire to present both sides of an issue with empathy and context, and really centering the voices of the people whose lived experiences informed the stories and news coverage I created for a variety of different publications and radio as well. And this also seemed, at the time, we started this project in early 2015. At the time, there wasn't a tremendous amount of news coverage on this issue, but what I had seen struck me as rather polarizing, in the sense that, there was one side, primarily Anglo, that was opposed to the monument, and then there was another side of primarily Native, who supported it, and there wasn't a lot of nuance there. And I knew there had to be more to it than just these deeply polarized views. And I also know that there's the coverage of rural areas and people who live in them can be kind of hard to come by and can be oversimplified. And so I really wanted to, as I've done in the rest of my reporting, try to understand the greater and more nuanced context for this story, and to really kind of center those voices and let them drive the story.
Yeah, I feel like in this, this Bears Ears issue, so many of the players have been characterized, as caricatures, as very monolithic voices. And part of what you unveil is a real diversity of opinions and approaches and different reasons for why people care about the region, how they view it in so many different ways. So I think that's really powerful.
I have to say, in full confession, that there were a number of long discussions regarding the structure of the book, and coming from an academic background, I had argued for a far more linear approach, and it was Rebecca who insisted that the best way to tell the story was through the voices of the individuals, and I was very fortunate that Rebecca has a voice at least as strong as her grandmother's, and she was able to persuade me, which I think is much to the benefit of the book and to its readers. And I have to say that as we went along, I started to open my mind to what Rebecca referred to as the nuances of the issue. I had been concerned all along with the sort of top-level issue of the health of rural counties adjacent to public lands, and that those questions were asked throughout the process. But what I didn't realize, and it became so vivid as we went through the process, was the incredible attachment that both Native and Anglo folks have to that land. And I think if Rebecca were speaking, she would say to most folks with whom we talked, the land is who we are.
And that's something we heard from people on both sides of this debate. You know, the different spiritual traditions often informed the debate in ways we did not anticipate, but this sense of having one's very identity shaped and informed by the landscape, and also the ancestral connection as well. And, you know, for Native peoples in the region, there is very tangible evidence of their ancestors in the canyons of the region, where you can find ruins and pottery shards and just different tangible reminders of people who came many hundreds of years ago to settle this landscape. And Native people also believe that they've been on that landscape since time immemorial. And the Anglo-Mormon population arrived significantly later in the mid to late 1800s, but they also feel that strong cultural and spiritual attachment to the land because they believe that their God, their heavenly Father, spoke directly to the prophet in the Mormon church, who instructed them to go settle this land and establish the first mission in southeast Utah. So they really believe that their journey is a spiritual one as well. It was a pilgrimage to get there, and they have deep reverence for their connection to the land, and also their tradition of what they see as stewardship of the land. The fact that they were able to create a life and a living in this very harsh, punishing landscape is a source of great pride. And sometimes the interpretation of stewardship is a bit contentious because sometimes that is tied to employment in extractive industries, which have in recent decades been sort of the bread and butter of the region. And for some other folks who are not part of the Anglo-Mormon population in the area, that doesn't necessarily correlate with the sort of land stewardship they perceive to be respectful of the environment. There's one other thing I wanted to add in terms of our approach to this book. I when I saw coverage of this issue in the national media, and again, at that time when we started the project, early to mid 2015, there hadn't been a lot of coverage on it, is that some national publications, by virtue of the fact that they're based on the East Coast and don't have a presence out west, or at least not a great presence in the Southwest, engaged in, what I call parachute journalism, where, people would come in for a weekend, interview a few of the loudest voices, and then return to their offices in New York or DC. And again, that's sort of by necessity, not having that presence on the ground. But what we really tried to do was spend as much time on the ground as possible. We first went down to San Juan County, home to Bears Ears, and really kind of the epicenter of this debate for a week or so in mid 2015, and then in fall 2015, we spent a month there, and we kept going back and going back and going back. And I think the fact that we did spend a lot of time on the ground, and we kept asking people for interviews and taking time to go out in the landscape with them, I think that really showed people that we were committed to telling this story in an in-depth and nuanced way. So I think that was a big part of how we were able to build these relationships, was really the thing in the time.
Do you think that opened things up more when they saw that you were not just parachuting in for a quick story?
I do. I think that was very significant. And I think the fact that we kept coming back demonstrated to people that not only were we very interested in the story, but we, had that commitment to trying to understand the nuances of the story, and also trying to appreciate the cultural context in which this debate was taking place, because that's a really significant part of this. Is there's that deep cultural and spiritual connection to the land. There's also a really difficult and painful history that both of these populations have experienced, both in terms of persecution by the federal government, as well as some of the issues of racism that between the two groups that have played out over the decades. And so that's a really important part of what these folks are bringing to this conflict over public lands, is that deep and sometimes painful history.
As you guys come in as outside reporters, there is the other big voice in this debate is often these outside conservationist groups,
right?
Or people involved in recreation or environmental protection, which are all have really strong voices in these debates about how they view Bears Ears as a special and sacred place, that needs to be protected for the benefit of people to use, but they're often outside groups. And I suspect that many of the people you interviewed could have initially viewed you in the same way, as another outside entity coming in to muck around in their local affairs. But again, you're being persistent and not just being interested in the story, but being interested in them and their voices. It seems to have cut through that to where you weren't viewed as an outside meddling force.
Yeah, and I mean, initially we very much were perceived that way.
But as I look through the list of interviews, I mean, anyone who's clued into the Bears Ears debates at all, the names here, Jonah Yellowman, Mark Maryboy, Phil Lyman and Rob Bishop, Heidi Red, Regina Lopez Whiteskunk. These are all names that I've seen pop up in, various things. I was astounded, and not just the number of people some of the people that you got to come speak who I think maybe would have been very suspicious of you, and that you might be misrepresenting them in one way or another. So it's an impressive roster.
Well,
thank you. And I want to jump in and say we, in some ways, we're the real beneficiaries of blind luck, in that we started this project before the issue became very well known,
yes.
and informed by occasionally sensationalistic media coverage. And so I think had we started this project a year later, in say mid-2016, after it had gotten national coverage in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then state-based coverage as well, the Salt Lake Tribune, which I must add has done an exemplary job of covering this issue for a number of years now, it would have been a very different story because say Phil Lyman and Mark Maryboy and other folks whose voices have been central to this debate, especially in terms of their appearance in national media, they would have been far less open, I believe, to a couple of Anglo folks, one of whom is from the big city. I lived in San Francisco at the time. Coming in and just being two more perhaps voyeuristic folks who wanted to present a sensationalized version of this story without any nuance. And so really, I think we just had the very good fortune of starting this project at a less contentious time.
Actually, we were fairly fortunate in working our way through. We started with Mark Beloy. I knew Mark, who introduced us to Mark Maryboy, and that facilitated that conversation. We made an appointment with Bill Boyle, who was editor of the San Juan Record, and our initial conversation was rather brief, but he said, by the way, do you guys know that there's a commissioners meeting being held today? And so we looked at one another and said, we ought to go down there and see whether we can schedule appointments with the three commissioners, Rebecca Banali, Bruce Adams, and Phil Lyman. So we stood outside the door of the commission meeting and spoke to each one of them, and they were more than generous in scheduling time for interviews. They were extremely eager to share their stories and perspectives. I agree with Rebecca that good luck and good fortune played a role, but it also is the generosity of folks, both native and Anglo in San Juan County, who made this book possible and made our lives easier. And I'll add one more thing, and that is that after the book was completed, I've contacted Bill Boyle, Alfred Lamacquahu, Charles Wilkinson.
Alfred Lamacquahu, at the time, was the co-chair of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition and a member of the Hopi Tribal Council.
So the reason I mention that is that these conversations have continued well after the publication of the book. And while I can't say that these folks are friends, they certainly are individuals for whom I've developed an enormous amount of respect. And when I want to understand something, either about Bears Ears or some of the other issues I'm trying to understand in rural Utah, I go to them, and they're equally as responsive today as they were when we first met.
You divide this book into a number of sections. In each, the chapters inside of each are each based off of a different interview with a different individual. I'm curious if maybe we could go through a few of these and give us kind of a sampling of some of the different diversity of voices. The sections, the first one is Connecting to Sacred Lands, Voices of Two Cultures. Part 2, Shaping the Future of Public Lands, Different Visions for San Juan County. The third, Protecting Ancestral Lands, Exercising Tribal Sovereignty. And then the last, A Path Forward, Establishing Trust, Healing Wounds. I mean, just the titles that they suggest kind of the broad range of approaches that you took here. And put in throughout are a number of interludes, which you wrote, Rebecca, zooming out and giving some broader context to cover some broader issues that maybe weren't covered in the interviews. So why don't we pick a few of the key voices and individuals that represent some of the various perspectives on the issue? And maybe you can kind of give us a little insight into why you found those specific voices to be particularly powerful or insightful.
Sure. I'll start with Phil Wyman because he's sort of been a lightning rod in this debate. So Phil has very deep ties to the region. His, great, possibly great again, grandfather helped establish the community of Blanding, which is the largest city, 3,000 people in San Juan County. So he has that deep pioneer heritage. And he's a San Juan County commissioner, was a San Juan County commissioner. Now he's a Utah State representative. But at the time, he was on the San Juan County Commission, which is the most powerful body of elected officials in the county. He has a very strong belief that local people, defined within very specific parameters, and not the federal government, should determine the management of public lands. So he's in favor of transferring the management of lands from the federal government agencies to the states. And so that, which is very much opposed by conservation organizations, a number of, but not all, Native peoples in the region. And what we discovered about him is he's sort of a Jekyll and Hyde character, which is kind of important to understanding his role in the debate as well. In some ways, he's very much a firebrand, and very absolutist in his views about how federal land should be managed. But in other ways, he has a more, he helped me out here, Steve.
I think that that Phil embodies within himself some of the contradictions in this story. He took the initiative to put together a public lands council in San Juan County in response to Representative Rob Bishop's effort to put together a comprehensive public land initiative. And the group that he put together would, at least from my personal perspective, I think it would be perceived as a fairly broad and representative set of stakeholders who debated what ought happen to the public lands in San Juan County, and actually came to again, my perception, fairly reasonable conclusions. He then subverted this effort by taking the now infamous ATV ride down Recapture Canyon,
yeah.
Which in many ways opened wounds and made it very difficult to bring all stakeholders together, and in particular to keep the Native community at the table. And it's very difficult to attribute the failure of that Public Lands Council and the PLI to that particular act, but it certainly exacerbated difficulties, and at least from my perspective, made it much more difficult to achieve compromise.
So Mark Maryboy, another prominent voice in this, he was a part of that coalition group with Lyman, correct? But he eventually left. I mean, I was struck. You quote Phil Lyman as saying, "Let's drop the whole facade of trying to work with our enemies and take a stand with our friends instead." I mean, I'm assuming it's in response to that kind of language and response that some of the Native peoples like Mark Maryboy did leave the table, correct?
Certainly, at least that would be a reasonable conclusion to draw. And Mark had, as Rebecca mentioned, served in the past on the commission. He was the first Native to serve on the San Juan County Commission, and certainly has suffered a fair amount of verbal and nonverbal abuse over the decades. And so I think words like that from Phil, and words that he has heard over his career, such as "go back to the reservation," certainly made Mark and people who share his views particularly skeptical of the sincerity of individuals involved with the Public Lands Council. And there was also the political clock running as well, with the end of President Obama's term coming. And so there was there had to be a choice made between going for a legislative solution or going for a national monument declaration by President Obama. And I think one of the many tragedies in this story is that there were time constraints, and building trust and coming to consensus takes more than the 2+ years they had, and putting together the recommendations to the PLI from San Juan County. And I just wondered whether in another universe, had there been another 2 or 3 or 4 years, that consensus might have actually been achieved despite some of the rhetoric, and a legislative solution, which was the original goal of the tribes. Whether that legislative solution might not have come to be.
I was going to ask, Rebecca, could you kind of give us some insight into Mark Maryboy? And he had formed the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, but it was kind of as a part of this shift away from the collaboration with Wyman and Rob Bishop and others, and moving, looking for a legislative solution, and moving towards the view that it was really only the nation-to-nation diplomacy between sovereign native peoples and the federal government was the way to move forward. Can you maybe give us some insight into that shift that Maryboy made?
Sure. So taking a step back for a second, Mark is a very interesting character in this story because he considers himself a traditional Navajo, so very much aligned with traditional spiritual beliefs, but he also is an extremely seasoned and skilled politician, and so very much speaks the language of Western style politics. And so in many ways, he was ideally suited to moving this whole process forward. In 2010, he was one of the co-founders of the grassroots nonprofit Utah Dinepikea, which is the original group that advocated for protection of the Bears Ears region through that legislative solution. And as time went on, and especially after Phil Wyman did his infamous ride through Recapture Canyon, damaging Native cultural resources, was largely seen as a slap in the face to Native people as well as conservationists. Mark and others determined that the best way forward would be to elevate the dialogue above the sort of county public lands council to a nation-to-nation dialogue with other sovereign nations. And he recognized that a grassroots nonprofit, albeit a very powerful one that had put together this really sophisticated proposal for protection of lands in the Bears Ears region, could not achieve the goals of protection on its own. And so he, along with others, started traveling to other reservations and pueblos in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado to convince tribes with very strong ancestral ties to the region that the best way to protect lands that were sacred to all of the tribes was to come together and form a coalition and formally petition the federal government to protect it as a national monument. And this is a very significant decision by Maryboy and others, because really it had never been done before, that tribes with oft contentious histories could put aside those differences and past wounds and sometimes current legal disputes and come together in service of a shared goal. It was very significant and remains significant.
What about some of the unexpected voices? We held an event here at the Red Center a couple of years ago, a roundtable on some of the different views of Bears Ears, and it was all Native voices, but we tried to bring in as many differing perspectives as we could. And one thing that surprised people was that there were Native peoples
some very opposed to the monument, some just with more complicated relationships to it and questions. And people were surprised it's not quite the monolithic voice as they thought. One person you spoke with in the book was Rebecca Banali, who can maybe give us a little insight into her, because here's a different voice that might be unexpected for a lot of people.
Sure, I'll start, and then Steve, if you want to jump in. So Rebecca Banali, at the time we interviewed her, which I believe was fall 2015, she was on the San Juan County Commission with Phil Wyman and their fellow commissioner, Bruce Adams, who's been a vocal monument opponent as well. And
she's Navajo,
and she's Navajo. Yeah. And her perspective, she was careful to qualify all of her remarks by saying she too considered herself a traditional Navajo with traditional Navajo spiritual beliefs. But she's also a member of the LDS or Mormon Church. And so she has that very interesting combined background wherein she has deep trust of the Anglo-Mormons, and she has beliefs that are quite different than the Native spiritual beliefs she also claims to hold sacred. And she was opposed to the monument for a number of reasons, chief among them that historically the federal government has not always had a harmonious relationship with Native peoples, and it's in fact been at various times patronizing and even committed deep atrocities against Native peoples, particularly against the Navajo people. And she said, why should we trust the federal government at this time to do the right thing and to do right by us and respect our cultural beliefs and protect land in a way that is sensitive to the cultural beliefs of Native peoples and the ways in which they traditionally use the land. And she also was concerned that a monument designation would prevent Native peoples from using the land in more traditional ways to gather wood, medicinal herbs, and things of that nature, despite the fact that language in the final monument proclamation very clearly stated that those traditional uses would be honored. She really became, like Phil Wyman, another lightning rod and very loud voice in this debate. And in fact, she testified before the Utah legislature. She traveled to D.C. She was held up by Utah Senator Orrin Hatch, U.S. Senator, I should say, Orrin Hatch, as an example of a Native person who was deeply opposed to the monument, just to include that oppositional Native voice. Steve, I don't know if you want to jump in and add anything.
I think she also expressed to us a strong interest in focusing on issues of economic importance to Navajos living in Utah. And one of the things that certainly occurred to me was whether part of her views were shaped by her belief that her primary obligation was to Navajos in southeast Utah, and that by taking either a neutral position or position supportive of Bears Ears, she would undermine her relationship with the other commissioners and evoke less support for some of the bread and butter issues that she felt were essential to the health of the folks that she represented. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Rebecca, but that certainly was one of the things that I picked up.
I would agree.
She had a lot of other issues she was concerned about as well. Yeah. What about from maybe some of the other side? Would you like to feature maybe one of the non-Native voices that surprised you or that was more complicated than you anticipated it would be?
You want to pick on Winston Hurst, Rebecca?
Why don't you?
I don't mean pick on him.
Why don't you pick on Winston Hurst, and then I'll talk about Heidi Red.
Well, Winston Hurst is a well-known archaeologist. LDS, lives in Blanding, and spans two cultural worlds. Winston recognized the effects of the two Blanding raids, 1986 and was it 2009?
These were, for listeners who don't know, the government raids into arrested a number of people that had been digging illegally and looting native artifacts and so forth.
And so Winston, as an archaeologist, was extraordinarily sensitive to the issue of looting. He confessed to having been brought up as a boy, not thinking about the importance of these relics and not thinking about the importance of their being left where they are so that a proper cultural history could be assembled. So he understood the almost natural desire to go out into the landscape and collect these artifacts as if they were simply that, artifacts, as opposed to things that were of deep meaning to still extant cultures. So he understood that, but also was particularly disturbed by the insensitivity of folks from the BLM who he felt unnecessarily inflamed or stoked the embers of distrust toward the BLM and the federal government in general. So here he is spanning two cultures, his role as a scientist, his role as a member of the Blanding community, and I guess it's three cultures, and a member of the LDS Church. And I think that he came across as deeply pessimistic about the possibility of achieving, at least in the short run, any sort of understanding either of the importance of these cultural artifacts or of how public lands could be used not only to serve people in the local community but more broadly people around the nation. Rebecca, do you think that captures?
I do. I would say, in a nutshell, when we heard about Winston Hurst, we knew he was one of the preeminent archaeologists in the Southwest. And, on the surface, one would think esteemed archaeologist with decades of helping to study and preserve native artifacts. Why would he not support the idea of a national monument? Seems like he might be one of the most vocal supporters. And yet, as we spoke to him and spoke to others who knew him, it became very clear that he was deeply ambivalent about it. And in fact...
but a lot of it really drills down to his concern that it needs to be locally controlled or sensitive to local peoples with local buy-in, right? This kind of skepticism of federal involvement.
Right.
You said that you wanted to make a note on Heidi Red?
Sure. She's another one where on the surface, just reading a brief bio of her, it seems like she too would be a natural supporter of the monument and very much aligned with the conservationist perspective on Bears Ears. She lives on a ranch in exquisitely beautiful territory near Indian Creek, which is one of the most famous rock climbing destinations in the nation, if not the world. And
yeah, for any listeners, if you've driven to the Needles district of Canyonlands, there's a ranch on the south side of the road called Dugout Ranch. And that's where Heidi Red is.
And she, for a number of years, has worked in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy on research on and around her ranch on the impacts of climate change on local flora and fauna. And so, again, working with the Nature Conservancy, it seems only natural that she would be very aligned with the conservationists who supported the monument from the get-go. And yet her perspective is very much informed by her, first of all, her long and deep history in the region that stretches back about 50 years. She also married into one of the most prominent Mormon families in the region, so she has that perspective as well. But she also has the perspective of someone who, over the decades, has watched traffic to the Needles region of Canyons National Park just explode, and recreationists coming to Indian Creek and climbing like crazy and creating a lot of noise and traffic. And to her, it just reeks of industrial tourism. And what's the impact of that on the landscape? And she also has a perspective on the benefit, the economic benefit of extractive industries to the county in past decades. She was one of many folks who told us, mining royalties helped, build the hospital. And, at the time, San Juan County teachers were the highest paid in the state. And it's worth noting that San Juan County has been the poorest county in the state of Utah for a long time. And so she gets the respect for and almost nostalgia for a time when extractive industries really helped the county be economically prosperous. And so she says, we should take a second both to respect the fact that extractive industries really helped this county be prosperous for a time, and also to note that tourism can be very hard on the land as well. So what is sort of a middle ground we can find in terms of finding a way to develop a robust economy in the county while also encouraging a type of tourism that could be less disruptive. And so she has that kind of interesting, nuanced perspective that one might not expect by just reading a quick bio of her.
Yeah. Well, I think throughout most of these individuals come off as much more nuanced than people might expect. You end the book with a coda, because after you'd done these interviews, a lot happened with the monument being established and then reduced and so forth. But kind of going along with what you're saying, you note that as you talk to all these people, you say, quote, they just want to be seen and heard. And it makes me think that perhaps having them being seen and heard out in the landscape is most profound, because maybe the land wants to be seen and heard as well through them. And that takes time, that takes dedication on your part of spending time with them and getting them out there to reveal that they all are more complex and than we would otherwise perhaps think. We are running out of time. I've never done a survey to see how long people are willing to listen to a podcast, but I suspect we might be nearing that point. Yeah. I always like to give people a chance to offer any closing thoughts on kind of other things that they're working on or moving forward on. And before we were recording, Stephen had mentioned a somewhat similar project or somewhat related, which I think would serve as a really good way to wrap this up. Stephen, you want to tell us about what you're working on in the San Rafael Swell region of Utah?
Yes, I would. It's an area that I have visited on and off for 40 years and intended once again to provide a visual introduction to the area as well as a more academic introduction to the paleontological, geological, and cultural history of the area. And as was the case for Bears Ears, this is an area that people had sought to protect for the better part of a generation. In fact, the people from Emery County, in which the San Rafael Swell sits, have made various efforts to provide certainty regarding the use of public lands by looking at various ways of protecting some parts and making use for economic reasons of others. So much is the case in Bears Ears. I was thinking of relating that history, capturing points of view as to from those who oppose it, protection, to those who embrace it. By some miracle, the Emery County Public Lands Management Act was passed in March of 2019, March of this year, and provided an opportunity to ask, how did that compromise come to be? What were the elements that made the San Rafael Swell come under protection? Why might Bears Ears have failed? And by looking at a couple of other recently protected large tracts of federal land, Boulder White Clouds in south central Idaho and Washington County in southwestern Utah, what lessons could be drawn as to the elements that allow people to come to compromise? And so I put together what in academic terms might be a set of case studies, but again, based on interviews with people on all sides of the issue, from the conservation community. And the conservation community, that's too broad a rubric. There is a tremendous spectrum of conservation groups, some relatively extreme and ideological, and others far more amenable to compromise, as well as people on the other side, the OHV community, other recreation interests, mining interests, and so on. I've talked to a very broad range of people, both in Emery County and in D.C. And in fact, I just got back from D.C. the end of last week. And anyway, I'm hoping to put together a book that, again, provides a visual introduction to the swell, an introduction to its history, and also a set of case studies and reflections on what leads to compromise regarding the use of public lands. And finally, how, in putting together those compromises, the effects of public land protection on rural economies can be not only looked at as part of the compromises, but elevated. I think it's really important, and at least one of the lessons that I've learned is that without those rural voices being heard and understood, and without their economic needs taken into account, discussions regarding the use of public lands will remain fraught. And it's surprising to me that there's so little conversation about the needs of rural communities. And without those voices, I don't think you can come to rational conclusions about how best to protect and make use of those lands. Anyway, I'm hoping to have this book manuscript finished sometime during the first quarter of next year. And unfortunately, what I lack is Rebecca's ability to vivify what I've managed to cobble together.
Well, I think it sounds great, and my friends will know my personal obsession with the swell. So I look forward to that.
we must talk.
Yes, yeah, we'll have more conversations. Rebecca, are you doing anything kind of related to these issues moving forward?
Shortly, the answer is no, although I will say we have a blog at our website, bearsearscountry.com, in which we continue to follow the developments in the Bears Ears story. There's pending litigation about Trump's decision to reduce the national monument, the fascinating coalition of conservationists, recreationists, outdoor clothing companies like Patagonia are involved, as well as members of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. So we continue to follow those developments. And so that's my current connection to the Bears Ears issue. Like I said, I do have to jump off. This has been a really wonderful conversation, Brenden, and thank you so much for having us.
Well, thank you guys for your work. It's been a real pleasure.
You bet. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Writing Westward is a production of the Charles Redd Center for Western Studies at Brigham Young University. Our theme music was provided by local Utah composer Micah Dahl Anderson. You can find him at Micah, D-A-H-L, Anderson with an O.com. I'll include a link in the episode description. Besides subscribing to the podcast, you can receive regular updates about upcoming episodes by following on Facebook or Twitter. My name is Brenden Rensink, and I serve here as the podcast host, producer, sound engineer, and pretty much everything else. So if you have any praise or critiques, you should probably just send them my way. I'm Associate Director of the Redd Center and an Associate Professor of History here at Brigham Young University. Feel free to contact me if you have any questions about the podcast, the Redd Center, our live-streamed lectures and events, funding opportunities, or anything else. If you have books you think I should consider for an episode, please send them my way. One last plug, I'm also the project manager and general editor of a great digital public history project hosted here at the Redd Center called Intermountain Histories. You can check it out by visiting www.intermountainhistories.org or download the free mobile app by searching Intermountain Histories on your Apple or Android devices. There you can read carefully curated histories of the region, complete with archival photos, bibliographies, and more. In any case, thanks again for listening to the episode. We'll see you next month.